Hello friends, good afternoon. Welcome to CEC EduSat lecture. As you know, we had yesterday a lecture on the conceptualizing early medieval in Indian history with our subject expert Dr. Shankar Kumar, who is an assistant professor, Department of History, Hindu College, University of Delhi. And today also we will be continuing with the same topic with same expert. So without wasting much time, I would like to welcome Dr. Shankar to our show and request him to begin his lecture.
Thank you, Asmita, and good afternoon, viewers. Let's begin from where we had left yesterday, and that was just a brief recap of what we did yesterday in the next 5 minutes or so, and then we shall be on with our unfinished task. We had spoken of the perspectives with which in Indian history, historians over a period of time have come to visualize and identify medieval times in Indian history, and more particularly the early medieval period. So, with respect to that, we spoke of the 1950s or the period till around the 1950s. When almost inadvertently, even the nationalist historians had got into the trap of using the same periodization blocks, that is ancient, medieval, modern, and almost holding it as coterminous with the religious affiliation of the rulers, mainstream rulers only, like Hindu, Muslim, and the British. To identify ancient, medieval, and modern, respectively. And subsequent to that, we spoke of Niharanjan Ray's works and his assertion, which does emphasize the need to have some kind of an analytical base to understand as to what is meant by ancient, what is meant by medieval and modern as such, and not using these labels as mere chronological labels for descriptive purpose. So, but we also did point to the fact that despite these assertions and despite identifying some of these elements of medievalism or attributes of medievalism, like decentralized polity, absence of trade, lack of urban centers, regionalization of language, scripts, and so forth, other cultural articulations. So Niharanjan Ray speaks of all these things, but there is no commensurate backing through regional studies or through empirical studies, which do tell us that at this point of time it seems to be a transformed society, or there is a progressive trend of change towards these attributes, leading to changed times as such. So that was some kind of a thing which was not available despite these assertions, and this gap, this critical gap in the historiography was filled very ably by the works of R.S. Sharma, who through his proposition of Indian feudalism for the first time very methodically speaks of the processes or the causal factors through which this transformation happened around the post-Gupta period, and hence in some way he is also according a different kind of understanding to the medieval times, which is very ably backed by empirical studies related to deurbanization, lack of monetization, or rupture of trade and commerce, particularly long distance trade and commerce, then land grants leading to parcelization of authority, then regional scripts and regional languages becoming the order of the day, and also the Bhakti ideology, which is studied with reference to the feudal ethos in R.S. Sharma's works. So, having discussed these, we tried to understand as to how early medieval period was accorded some kind of an identity of its own. It is these changed circumstances which gave a distinct identity to early medieval times to begin with. And that is where probably we had ended, because we had also introduced in yesterday's interaction the counterpoint raised by B.D. Chattopadhyay, who counters R.S. Sharma's proposition and argues for having a different kind of perspective with which we need to look at history, or for that matter, which can lead to some kind of a reassessment of the early medieval times, because because he says that the way R.S. Sharma presents the case of the feudalism, the causal factors that he discusses, be it rupture of long distance trade and commerce, or Kali age crisis leading to the increased instance of land grant donations and sub-infeudation and so forth, characterizing the early medieval times or the post-Gupta times. He says that if we view this from this perspective, from Professor Sharma's perspective, then it appears, and this is B.D. Chattopadhyay's assertion, that it appears that the medievalism in Indian history has resulted on account of the breakdown of the social matrix of ancient India. So, whatever characterized ancient India, since those attributes have disintegrated, those attributes have vanished, therefore medievalism results. And let's pause and discuss a little bit in detail as to what he means, what Professor Chattopadhyay means when he makes this kind of assertion with respect to Professor Sharma's proposition. Essentially, if you read the arguments of Professor Chattopadhyay, he says that actually ancient as a term is loaded with several attributes, and it doesn't quite carry some specific identity of its own. He says that in chronological terms, we tend to regard ancient as the period which begins from around, say, Vedic times, or for that matter, the coming of the Aryans, or if you go back now that we know about Harappan civilization as well, it can include Bronze Age civilizations. Then we have a range of archaeological cultures informing us about the Chalcolithic times. We have the Vedic age, we have the later Vedic age, we are into the early historical phase, Mauryan Empire, then smaller states, and then again Gupta Empire. So the entire stretch of experiences that, or the entire stretch of events and historical processes that come under this chronological bracket of ancient makes it difficult to singularly identify a particular trait or a set of traits identifying what constitutes ancient. And if we have problems related to identifying ancient, how can we say that it is as a result of the breakdown of what constituted ancient, which led to the rise of medieval or early medieval in our discussion? So, B.D. Chattopadhyay makes this point that in Professor Sharma's proposition, it appears that what he means, that what Professor Sharma means by ancient is something which is happening, or which constitutes the attributes of 6th century BC first, that is 6th century BC North India. So it is around the middle of the first millennium BC, and the Gangetic plains, or particularly the middle Gangetic plains, whatever is happening around this period becomes the dominant imagery of ancient India as such. So in political terms, it would mean monarchical state. We all know that in 6th century BC, by around 6th century BC, and even subsequent to it, monarchy had become the order of the day, at least in northern part of India. And a strong territorial state, monarchical state, centralized empires which are hugely bureaucratized, and this again is a carryover from the Kautilya's Arthashastra nationalistic historians had latched on to Kautilya's Arthashastra in projecting a Mauryan empire as hugely centralized and bureaucratized, also in order to counter the British claim during the Indian struggle for independence and so forth. We had spoken about it in yesterday's discussion. So that is the political angle of 6th century BC reality, which Professor Chattopadhyay says that becomes the identifier for Professor Sharma for the entire ancient period and for the entire stretch of Indian subcontinent. Similarly, in economic terms, 6th century BC is identified with respect to monetized economy, because we have a lot of punch-marked coins coming from this period, which is the first instance of metallic coins at this scale found from Indian subcontinent as such. We also get to see huge commercial transactions. We have merchants, we have trade routes, Dakshinapath, Uttarapath, and so forth. So it's a very, you can say, urban, cosmopolitan, transaction-led, where liquidity is not an issue. So lot of transactions are happening, and of course agriculture has come to stay in a big way. So primarily agrarian, but lot of urban and service sector, tertiary sector prospering in these times. So that constitutes the economic image of ancient, as Professor Chattopadhyay says with respect to R.S. Sharma's works. Similarly for social and religious. So the point that we are making here is that Professor Chattopadhyay is saying that it is this 6th century BC North India picture which goes on to become the predominant image of Professor Sharma's characterization of the entire ancient period. And with respect to the specific example of the Mauryan period, Mauryan dynasty, Mauryan kingdom, Professor Chattopadhyay says that if we subject this image to the actual historical processes in its temporal and spatial grid, in its temporal and spatial reality, that is time and space grid, then we get a different kind of a picture altogether. And this is the point that we had been speaking of in the last interaction as well. Because if we take, say, the instance of Deccan or northern part of central India as such, or for that matter the peninsular India, what is the archaeological reality there during the Mauryan period. And we get to see that here we have megalithic culture thriving probably around the time that we talk of Mauryan Empire as such. Similarly, over a period of time in the post-Mauryan times, we get to see emergence of early historical phase in this area in the form of the Satvahans, and then subsequently this local state formation as a process kicks in, and we have the Vakataks, etc., who emerge into the historical scene at around this period. So, Professor Chattopadhyay's proposition is about studying things with respect to focus on space and time, and not generalizing the dominant image which is actually the reality of one area of an empire to encompass the entire empire, or for that matter pan-India image. So, that is something that he points out is very critical to understanding early medieval times. And if we adopt this perspective, if we have this vantage point to look at Indian history, then we will see that there are some fundamental historical processes like state formation, like social distanciation leading to stratification of dominance and subordination relationship in society and so forth. These are some fundamental perennial historical forces happening in Indian history at different points of time at different places, and we need to actually track that. And that is what Professor Chattopadhyay is trying to say in his critique to the periodization of ancient, medieval and so forth. And he goes on to say that if we do this, then if we are to track the root of these fundamental processes, the actual historical ways in which these forces unfolded in different regions, then we get to have a different kind of image about the early medieval times, which is far removed from some kind of negativity with which medievalism is associated, particularly early medieval times is associated, because if we presume that early medieval kicked in as a result of disintegration of whatever constituted ancient, then of course we are not attributing any positivity, any positive impulse to the early medieval period. But if we try and understand what are the instances where in Deccan area, in peninsular India, in eastern India, in Gujarat, in Rajasthan, how local state formation as a process happens, how over a period of time regional polities emerge over the local state formations and so forth, then we are probably attributing this period with fair degree of positivity, with fair degree of we can say formative impulses. And that is the central piece of Professor Chattopadhyay's argument. So, what he essentially tries to do is to locate the instance where, or locate instances where in different parts of Indian subcontinent around this time, around the post-Gupta period, the farming community or peasant society emerges in the records. Because as we know that local state formation has several preconditions, and one of the critical preconditions is that the area where local state comes into being historically should have enough in itself to continuously produce surplus, and in the ancient times we can only think of agrarian surplus as the resource through which the apparatus of the state could elaborate itself, and of course it could be aided by fair bit of exposure to trade, exchange, or if it is not trade, at least customary customary exchanges or ritual exchange of items. Over a period of time, it does acquire the form of trade, that is regular exchange through some monetized means and so forth. So, that is the real and actual intent of Professor Chattopadhyay, that is to identify at what point of time peasant groups are appearing in the historical records for different regions. And when we do that, of course, the first criteria of local state formation gets satisfied. And over a period of time, if we go on tracking the same process, then we will also discover that the continuous process of say intensification of agriculture leading to more and more surplus gives us a situation where social segregation or social we can say stratification ripens to the extent that one group, one local group comes to acquire some special status and emerges as the ruling lineage, as the ruling family, as the ruling power. And when this process gets kicked in, we also, it is not as if this happens only in isolation all through the local circumstances, but there are several extraneous factors which influence or which at times works as catalysts to quicken the pace of this stratification and state formation. It could be the land grants, it could be the donations, it could be the influx of the Brahmins who spread the Varna ideology and hence quicken the pace of stratification, and that distanciation between the ruling class and the common people becomes all the more acute, and that allows surplus to be accumulated in a single you can say hand, to the extent that it could be redistributed through state apparatus. The state apparatus itself could be sustained on a regular basis, and that is how the tentacles of the state or the apparatus of the state gets elaborated with more and more surplus at its behest. So, these are the fundamental issues that Professor Chattopadhyay picks up, and I would like our viewers to understand some of these actual examples that he cites, and with that intent I can tell you about the ruling lineages of the Ikshwakus, the early Pallavas, the early Kadambas in the parts of Deccan, which is actually coterminous with the time that we are talking of, the late Gupta period and post Gupta period. And by the time we reach 7th to 10th century Common Era, these local state formations and the processes that we have been talking of have matured to the extent that there is emergence of regionalizations. There is emergence of regional element, which is like quite a few local states coming together to give a regional flavor, supra-local flavor, and that is something which gets reflected in say Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Marathi, Oriya as languages, and also maybe architecture styles, food habits, literary creations, and so forth. So, it is this emergence of regionality in Indian history, which is spoken of as the beginning of medievalism, or that is the dominant characterizing feature of early medieval times. And one has to take sides. Either we subscribe to the view of Professor Sharma, who presents the case as a disintegration of things ancient leading to this kind of a situation, or Professor Chattopadhyay's viewpoint, who rather adopts a processual approach to understand and track the process of local state formation leading to the emergence of regions in Indian history. The difference on account of the differing perspective of the two scholars is that in Professor Chattopadhyay's scheme of things, these regional states which emerged in the early medieval times are not imbued with a sense of negativity. Rather, it is seen and presented as a formative period of Indian history. So, that is one change that we can see resulting from the perspective of B.D. Chattopadhyay. And having discussed this, let me quickly inform you about some of the specific case studies. For instance, in the case of Gurjaras, that is Gujarat, Rajasthan area, we do start getting epigraphic records in the early medieval period, where the transition of this community from pastoral groups to cultivators can very easily be detected. So, it is around this time, around the early medieval times, that we find that Gurjaras, who earlier are mentioned as pastoral groups inhabiting the Rajasthan Gujarat area, are now emerging as cultivators, as peasants, and that means that some kind of surplus generation possibility becomes a reality for them, and that allows them to emerge as source of political power as well. These Gurjar families, some Gurjar lineages start becoming, they take to political rule as well in these areas. So, there are dynasties named after them, and it is actually through this process that this could become a reality. Similarly, in the case of Odisha also, we have emergence of the Chol Gangas by say around 11th century, who emerged as a major power, and 4th to 11th century is the period where we have constant shifts in the centers of power, and formation of new lineages side by side is happening, and there are some stable lineages, but by around 11th century in Odisha we have the Chol Gangas emerging as the stable ruling lineage, and that kind of completes the process of emergence of regions or emergence of Odisha as a region in Indian history, and again that is happening in the early medieval times. The same can be said for South Indian cases as well. We have the case of say Pallavas and Pandyas who emerge in the peninsular India from around 7th to 9th century AD. So, this is the time 7th to 9th century AD is the period where the Pallavas and the Pandyas have emerged as stable ruling lineages, and Cholas follow immediately from 9th to 13th century, who gave a distinct political and cultural identity, regional identity to the area that they are ruling in. So, we have the crystallization of macro regions in Indian history with distinct socio-political culture around this time. In Deccan, we have already seen, and in peninsular India subsequent to it. So, it is this particular process of expansion of the agrarian base leading to possibility of more surplus generation, simultaneous stratification of society from erstwhile egalitarian spirit, which allows some lineages or some groups to emerge or even transform from, say, pastoralism or other activities to the mainstream cultivating groups, and subsequently emerge as the local ruling stratum. And that means that the theoretical conditions of the emergence of local states have already been satisfied, and over a period of couple of centuries we find that there is some kind of a supra-local arrangement that happens on account of specifics of the time and space, leading to emergence of some kind of a regional flavor to whatever is happening in these areas, and that is articulated in the specifics of say language, architecture, or several other ways and means through which this can be articulated. So, this is the basic you can say difference between the perspectives that we just now spoke of in order to conceptualize as to what constitutes early medieval. So, for the students, what is important is that there are different perspectives with which historians have looked at this problem of identifying. We spoke of the initial ambivalence with which these labels, ancient, medieval, modern, were used. We spoke of the concern raised by several scholars to attribute some specific meaning to what constitutes ancient, what constitutes medieval, and so forth, despite regional studies, despite specific empirical studies being absent. We also spoke of the plugging in which was done through R.S. Sharma's works, in the sense that this major problem where we kept talking of medieval attributes, but we had no specific study to substantiate it. That was that meat and substance to that skeletal periodization was provided by Professor Sharma's work, where he proposes Indian feudalism. Now, the perspective, the causal factors that he identifies for the emergence of feudalism leads to some kind of an imagery about ancient, some kind of an imagery about early medieval, which at times inadvertently also became somewhat negative for early medieval period, in the sense that the agency, the active agency of the areas around Deccan and South India was somewhat inadvertently minimized, and that is something which is highlighted by Professor Chattopadhyay's works, who says that we need to change the perspective with which we look at things, and he proposes the temporal spatial context of studying some fundamental historical processes like local state formation, and social stratification, which can allow us to detect the time different areas of Indian subcontinent experienced peasantization, experienced intensive cultivation, experienced social differentiation to the extent that one social group from an undifferentiated past could emerge as the ruling stratum, as the ruling lineage, and that provided some kind of a context to the process of local state formation. Then there are external impulses. It could be the impulse generated from erstwhile Mauryan Empire, which was centralized, bureaucratized, where trade, commerce, intensive cultivation, etc. were order of the day. And being part of the same empire, there could be several ways and means through which those impulses could be transmitted to these areas, which worked as catalyst in order to quicken the pace of these fundamental changes. And that meant that the process got all the more intensified, and it allowed these local state formation processes to coalesce into some kind of a regional identity, and over a period of time we do find the regional identity getting articulated, and this is the time when this is happening, that is the early medieval times, the post-Gupta period. And by around 11th, 12th century, we find that in major, for instance, we didn't talk of the case of Assam, and we have evidence where certain groups emerged as a peasant group, and over a period of time they did leverage political power as a result of that differentiation as well. Even if they could not become the ruling stratum, at least they were very formidable peasant groups who could resist the state power. So the case of Kaivartas in Bengal and Assam is a very good example with respect to that. So it is the processual, we can say, perspective of B.D. Chattopadhyay, which appears to be the latest in terms of the historiography that we have traced with respect to understanding and conceptualizing as to what constitutes or what constituted early medieval. And we have come a long way from ambivalence to some kind of secondary or negative treatment to the period, to some kind of infusion of positivity and some formative impulses characterizing early medieval period, which is stretches up to say 11th, 12th century AD from around 8th century AD onwards.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for such interesting lecture. We hope that we will be having more insightful lecture with you in future also. Dear viewers, if you have any queries or questions regarding this lecture, please write us back on our official email ID, which will be showing just after this lecture. And stay tuned, keep watching. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.